As a series, God of War has always been kinda goofy, being remembered for its mid-2000s edge and ridiculous levels of violence more than pretty much anything else. God of War, as a soft reboot for the franchise, wants to be seen in a different light, with an older, less overtly psychopathic Kratos in the lead role. So does this tonal shift work out in God of War's favour, or is it still a goofy piece of heavy metal album art come to life? Let's take a look. God of War takes place after God of War 3 and follows Kratos on his journey to fulfill the final wishes of his recently deceased wife, with his son Atreus by his side. It's a much more personal plot than we've seen in previous games, and while it's not devoid of the epic set-piece moments that the God of War franchise is known for, the fact that this isn't some huge save-the-world effort from the outset is actually pretty refreshing. It feels like we're going back to God of War 1, albeit with a more sympathetic protagonist who is actually trying to be better and pass on the wisdom of his many mistakes to his son. The relationship between Kratos and Atreus is at the heart of God of War, and the interaction between them is outstanding. Atreus is naive, curious, and often immature, and while not as endearing as other kid companions in video games, he makes for an interesting foil for the uber-masculine, world-weary Kratos. Kratos himself may just be the most surprising aspect of the game. Instead of a rage machine that would fly into a blind fury at the slightest hint of inconvenience, Kratos now feels a lot more sensible and sympathetic. He's still not entirely likable, but he's a far more engaging character than he has been previously, and watching him not only struggle with keeping his godly anger in check, but also struggling to keep his son from following a similar path, is compelling to say the least. With so much of the game's emotional weight riding on the back of this relationship, it would have been easy for it to come off as two-dimensional or half-hearted. Thankfully, the game features top-notch voice work that brings these characters and their interactions to life. Small things like a shift in Atreus' attitude, or the difference between Kratos' solemn, guarded dialogue and the rare occasions where he actually lets loose, bring more actual character to the series than anything from the 6 or 7 games that came before it. And it's all just a single piece of God of War's exceptional sound design, complete with epic orchestral scores and some of the best sounding combat I've ever experienced in a game. The world itself comes to life with exceptional graphics and a visual style that feels less over-the-top badass and more otherworldly and believable than previous games. There are still elements that would be perfectly at home on the cover of a heavy metal album, but there's a very Del Toro-esque design to the many characters and monsters on offer, so Midgard ends up feeling fresh and distinct from ancient Greece. It's certainly helped along by a more vibrant colour palette, and as I mentioned earlier, the overall graphical fidelity is simply stunning. Oddly, one of the visual elements that struck me the hardest was the use of the camera. Where God of War games of the past feature multiple static cameras that were unique for each area, this game is presented as one long cut, and the way that it's constantly following Kratos' adventure without showing any external information gives the game a far more intimate feeling. You are on this mythical road trip with Kratos and Atreus. You don't know anything that they don't, and that mystery is refreshing and exciting. The choice of camera is probably the biggest shift for the series in a mechanical sense as well. Having these big wide angles in previous games gave you all the information you needed about a scene, whether it was a puzzle or a combat scenario. Now, outside of the cutscenes, the camera is firmly stuck behind Kratos' back. You can't see a whole lot that isn't already in your face, so when the game throws as many enemies at you as you'd expect to see in any previous game, things feel much more intense and boxed in. Much like previous games, God of War is an action game where you chain together combos, blocks, and other maneuvers to progress, and while the combat remains visceral and empowering, with an incredibly satisfying axe throw and return mechanic added in for good measure, the aforementioned camera change comes with a few more adjustments to the tried and true formula. Combat still requires the use of light and heavy attacks, but the game opts for a more one-on-one focus for the most part. Additionally, most enemies, even the earliest grunts, pose a decent threat, especially on the higher difficulties. The biggest adjustment from previous games comes when dealing with threats that surround you. Because you're really only able to see what's going on in front of you and to your immediate sides, it's easy to get blindsided by opportunistic enemies, and being ganged up on and stun-locked in a corner is probably what led to most of my deaths in the game. God of War approaches this challenge by using Atreus as your backup. Not only is he useful for distracting and crippling enemies as you fight, he also yells warnings to the player when they're being surrounded or attacked from a flank. There's also an unintrusive visual indicator to aid players in this regard, and while it would be easy to miss this on its own, combining the audio and visual cues works really well. Unseen attackers are still a threat, but you're given enough warning to deal with them. Beyond the base mechanics of God of War's combat, there's a lot of variety and customization to be had. You have various armor pieces, special runic attacks, and weapons to alternate between, giving you plenty of options when taking on enemies. Getting the best and coolest stuff often requires a bit of exploration and gives you a decent incentive to complete the side content, as if getting more of Kratos and Atreus wasn't enough of an incentive. If you are looking to upgrade Kratos to his absolute best, then you're likely to run into the majority of the game's puzzles as well, which, though excruciatingly simple, do serve as a good enough break from slaying monsters. Searching a room for ceiling runes to destroy may not seem like much to sink your teeth into, but it works perfectly well as a breather. That might actually be my biggest issue with the game. There isn't a huge amount of gameplay variety on offer in God of War. There are simple puzzles usually concerned with finding things that open other things or throwing your axe at stuff, and platforming sections that are less interactive than your standard Uncharted game, but the combat is the meat of the game. And thankfully this doesn't feel like much of a problem because the combat is so customizable and varied on its own, so the game never feels like it's boring. At the end of the day, I'd rather take a single focused mechanic over a dozen half-baked ones anyway. The only other thing I could complain about is the small handful of actual unique boss fights on offer, but these moments are so epic and memorable partly because of their scarcity that it's hard to feel too let down by the selection. The fact that the main story takes about 20 hours to wrap up, which is mostly either fighting dudes or wandering the realms between those fights, and the fact that I'm still clamoring for more once the credits rolled should tell you exactly how much I enjoyed my time with God of War. Luckily for me, there is still plenty of game on offer. One of the benefits to God of War's shift to a more open-world Metroidvania approach to progression is that there are plenty of unexplored corners of the world for me to go and clean up, even after finishing the game. If any of the early optional content that I've experienced is an indication, some of the most satisfying and interesting challenges are yet to come, and that is so awesome. With all that in mind, I have to say, God of War is excellent. The game is an almost entirely different beast to the series that came before it, and while those weren't bad games, God of War blows them right out of the water. Its more serious tone combined with a subdued personal story make for an experience that feels more human than any of the previous games, even though it's dealing with gods and monsters of epic proportions. The gameplay is hard-hitting and focused, with variety on offer for those who want to experiment. If I had to sum it up in a sentence, I'd say this: God of War for PS4 is to the original games as The Last of Us was to the Uncharted series. It's heavier, more dynamic, and more challenging. And although they share the same parts, it feels distinct and most importantly, it feels good. God of War is a must-buy for PS4 owners and a system seller for anyone without a PS4. Go get it.